Orchestrated original Western narrative with fresh characters. Avoided forbidden names. Structured emotional arc. Orchestrated original Western narrative with fresh characters. Avoided forbidden names. Structured emotional arc. In the spring of 1889, in a stretch of Colorado high country, where the only year-round water for 30 miles bubbled up out of a granite seam on the Dwyer homestead, a woman could lose everything her family had built on the strength of a banker's signature and a lie told twice. Maren Dwyer found that out the hard way on the morning they nailed the sale notice to her father's barn door. She stood in the yard in a dress gone thin at the elbows, 24 years old, and a month an orphan, watching a man she'd never met hammer 2 cents worth of nails into wood her father had split by hand. And she understood for the first time that grief was not the worst thing the world had waiting for her. There was something underneath grief, and its name was helplessness, and it tasted like creek water gone bad. The notice said the homestead would go to auction the following Saturday on the courthouse steps in Ledger Gulch. It said the Dwyer place was being sold to satisfy a debt of $1,100, plus interest, plus fees owed to the Cattleman's Trust and Savings. Maren had never seen a note for $1,100 in her life. Her father had not been a man who borrowed. Conrad Dwyer had come up from Missouri with a wagon, a wife who died of the fever their second winter, a daughter not yet 4, and a stubbornness so complete it bordered on a kind of grace. He'd found the spring by accident, chasing a wounded elk into the rocks, and he'd built his life around it the way other men built their lives around a wife or a church. He used to say the water was the only honest thing in the territory. Everything else, he said, would lie to you given half a chance. He'd been dead 5 weeks. The official word was that he'd fallen from the rim above the upper pasture while mending fence, that his horse had spooked, that it was the kind of accident that took men in that country every season. Maren had buried him on the slope above the spring, where he'd wanted to lie, and she'd believed the official word for exactly as long as it took her to find his good rope, coiled and dry in the tack room. The rope he never went up to the rim without, the rope that should have been on his saddle if he'd been up there working at all. She didn't have the money. She knew that the way you know the temperature of a thing without touching it. She had $40 in a coffee tin. 11 head of cattle Roderick Sloane's men had somehow managed to scatter twice that month, and a spring that half the territory wanted, and only one man could afford to take. That man was Roderick Sloane himself, and on the Saturday of the sale he arrived at the courthouse in a black coat brushed clean as Sunday, with a gold watch chain across his belly, and 2 of his riders standing a little behind him like the shadows of a larger thing. He was not an unhandsome man. That was what unsettled people about him. He had a wide, easy face and a way of laughing that made you want to be in on the joke, and he ran the only bank within a day's ride, and he owned the freight line, and he sat on the board that decided which homesteads got their water claims recorded and which got lost in a clerk's drawer for a year and a half. He had wanted the Dwyer spring for 6 years. Conrad had told him no 6 different ways, the last of them a good deal less polite than the first. A small crowd had gathered on the steps, the way crowds gather for a hanging or a sale, which in that country could amount to nearly the same thing. There were ranchers who owed Sloane money, and so came to be seen owing him their presence. There were women from the Methodist sewing circle, who came because Maren had no mother and no aunt, and somebody decent ought to stand near her even if they couldn't do a thing. There was the auctioneer, a tired man named Greta's husband Holm, who hated this part of his work, and did it anyway because his children ate. And there was Maren in the front, in her thin dress, holding her father's hat against her chest, because she had nothing else of his small enough to hold. The auctioneer read the description of the property in a flat voice. He read the terms. He asked for an opening bid, and the silence that came back at him was the polite silence of people who already knew how this ended. Then Sloane lifted one gloved finger and said, 1100, in a tone that suggested he was doing everyone a favor, and the auctioneer drew a breath to close it. He never got the word out. A horse came up the main street of Ledger Gulch at a walk, which was its own kind of statement, because everyone who had ever needed to make an entrance did it at a gallop. This man did not need to make an entrance. He let the slowness of the animal do the talking. He was big through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who'd spent years swinging an axe and breaking their own trail, and his hair had gone past long into something closer to wild, and he had a beard streaked the color of dead grass, and he wore buckskin gone dark with smoke and grease, and a coat made of something he'd clearly killed himself. He had not been seen in town in 4 years. Some of the older men knew him. The name went down the crowd in a whisper like a fuse burning. His name was Jonah Tate, and the stories about him were the kind that get worse and truer the further they travel. That he'd had a wife and a child down on the flats once, and lost them to a winter and a fire and a thing he never spoke of. That he'd gone up into the high country afterward and not come down. Not for the census, not for the war that was over by then, not for anything. That he trapped and traded once or twice a season at the Salazar store and spoke to no one, and that Inez Salazar was the only living soul who could say she'd heard him laugh. That he was either a killer or a saint, and that there was, in that country, frequently no daylight between the two. He swung down off the horse at the foot of the courthouse steps, and the two riders behind Sloane shifted their weight, and Jonah looked at them once, briefly the way a man looks at weather he's decided not to worry about. Then he looked at Maren. He looked at her for a long moment, at the thin dress and the hat held against her chest and the dry eyes that had run out of tears days ago, and something moved behind his face that nobody in that crowd could read. 1101, he said. Sloane turned slowly. I beg your pardon. Auction's open, ain't it? Jonah's voice was rusty from disuse, like a hinge that wanted oil. Heard a bid. I'll raise it $1. Holm the auctioneer looked like a man who'd been handed a lit lamp in a powder house. He glanced at Sloane. He glanced at the document in his hand. The terms require funds in hand, the full. Jonah reached into his coat and drew out a leather pouch the size of a man's fist and let it fall open on the auctioneer's table, and gold spilled out of it across the wood, dust and small nuggets and 3 thick double eagles, and it made the particular soft heavy music that gold makes and nothing else does. The crowd made a sound. Sloane did not. That's better than 1100, Jonah said. Count it if you like. I'll wait. You can't simply? Sloane began, and his easy face had gone tight at the edges. Holm, this is irregular. The man is a vagrant, a squatter. He has no standing to. He's got gold, somebody in the crowd said, which is more standing than most of us got. Sloane's head turned toward the voice, and the voice belonged to no one in particular and to everyone, and he could not punish all of them at once. Maren watched him calculate it. She had watched her father read Sloane the same way, across a fence line, 6 years of reading him. The man did not lose. The man had never lost. He was not constructed to lose, and you could see him reaching for the lever that would set the world right again. And Maren understood with a cold drop in her stomach that the lever existed, that there was always a lever, that a man like Sloane did not walk into a thing he hadn't already found the back door out of. The note, Sloane said, and his voice came smooth again, recovered, and that was worse than his anger. The note has a provision. In the event the property passes from the family at sale, the trust retains the prior water claim recorded under the original survey, recorded under the trust's name, 3 years past. Mr. Tate may buy the dirt. The water is the trust's. He smiled. The dirt's worth nothing without it. I'd say he's overpaid by $1,100. And there it was, the back door, and the crowd's brief warmth went out like a coal under a boot. Because they all knew the water was the only thing. That the homestead without the spring was 40 acres of rock and sage. That Sloane had just bought the thing that mattered for the price of a clerk's signature, 3 years before anyone thought to need it. Maren felt her face go hot. She'd heard her father say it. The survey's wrong. The claim's a forgery. The man recorded my water under his own name and called it a clerical correction. She'd heard him say he had the proof. She'd never found it. She'd torn the cabin apart looking and found nothing but his rope, coiled and dry where it should not have been. Jonah Tate looked at Sloane for a while. Then he looked at the Reverend, a thin, nervous man named Brennan, who'd come down from the church to watch and now wished he hadn't. That claim, Jonah said, passes with marriage too, don't it? Joint claim. Husband and wife. The water stays with the homestead. That's territorial law, older than your note. Brennan swallowed. That is technically a married woman's homestead claim, the appurtenant water. Yes, but. Then marry us, Jonah said. The word landed on the courthouse steps and just sat there. Maren turned and stared at him. She had spoken to this man for the length of 0 words. She did not know the color of his eyes from this distance, only that he had them. He was a story she'd been told as a child to frighten her into coming inside before dark, and he had just proposed to her in front of 40 people and a banker and God, and he was not even looking at her when he said it. He was looking at Sloane, and there was something in his face that was not about her at all. Something old and banked down and furious, and she had the sudden understanding that whatever this was, she had walked into the middle of a fight that had started long before she was born. You can't be serious, Sloane said. Reverend. Jonah didn't raise his voice. You marry folks, or you just watch? Brennan looked at Maren. He really looked at her, the way a man looks when he's about to ask a terrible question and already knows he has no right to. Miss Dwyer, he said quietly, is this, do you? And Maren Dwyer 24 years old, a month an orphan, holding her dead father's hat against her chest, looked at the wide, easy, hateful face of the man who had killed him. Because she knew now, in that instant, with the certainty of the rope in the tack room, that Sloane had killed him, that the water had been worth a man's life to him. She looked at Sloane, and then she looked at the wild stranger who'd ridden in at a walk and thrown gold on a table, and she did the only sum that mattered. Yes, she said. Her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. Marry us. It was not a wedding. It was a transaction with a Bible present. Brennan rushed through it in under 3 minutes, his finger trembling on the page, and Jonah said the words flat and quiet, and Maren said them in a voice that sounded like someone else's. And when Brennan reached the part about kissing the bride, Jonah hesitated for the first time. He turned and looked at her, finally full on, and his eyes were a brown so dark they were nearly black, and there was an apology in them that he would never say out loud. He bent and kissed her once, careful, like a man handling something he was afraid of breaking, and it lasted no longer than a breath, and the crowd on the steps made it sound again, and somewhere in the back a woman from the sewing circle began, helplessly, to cry. Sloane did not move, but as Jonah took Maren's hand and walked her down the steps toward his horse, the banker spoke, low, just for the two of them. Enjoy your spring, he said. Water's a fragile thing. So are people who live a long way from town? Jonah didn't answer. He helped Maren up onto the horse, swung up behind her, settled his arm around her waist the way you'd brace a load you didn't want to lose, and said, against her ear, the first words he'd ever spoken to her alone. Hold the horn. We're going up. They rode out of Ledger Gulch into the foothills, and the town fell behind them in the dust, and Maren did not look back, because she was afraid that if she did, she'd see Sloane still smiling, and she could not afford to carry that smile up the mountain with her. They climbed for the rest of the day. He took trails she would not have recognized as trails, switchbacks under dark timber, a creek crossing where the water ran fast and cold over green stones. He didn't talk, neither did she. The anger she'd been too numb to feel on the courthouse steps came up in her slowly, the way feeling comes back into a frozen hand, and it hurt the same way. You bought me, she said at last, into the silence, into the smell of horse and pine and the smoke that lived in his coat, same as he would have, with money, in front of everyone. No, Jonah said. It looked exactly the same. It wasn't. He let the horse pick its way over a fallen log. He'd have owned you. I just married you. There's a difference, and you'll know it by tomorrow, because tomorrow you can saddle that horse and ride down the mountain, and I won't follow you, and the spring stays yours either way. That's the difference. You've got a door. He'd have walled you in. She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one. She was too tired. She'd been too tired for 5 weeks. She sagged back against his chest finally, not because she trusted him, but because her body had simply quit asking her permission, and his arm steadied her, and they climbed. His place was a cabin and a barn and a meat house set in a high meadow where a smaller spring of his own came out of the rocks, and there was snow still in the shadows in May, and the silence up there was so complete it had a weight to it. He put her in the cabin and slept in the barn and did not so much as look at her wrong, and on the second morning, when she came out and found her father's horse missing, he'd let it up himself, somehow, gone down in the night and brought it back. And she understood that the door he'd promised her was real. She stopped expecting him to become the thing the stories said he was. It took weeks to get the truth out of him, and longer to give him hers. He talked the way a man talks who's forgotten how, in short flat pieces, and the picture assembled itself slowly across cookfires and chores. He'd known her father. That was the part that stopped her heart. Years back, before the high country, Jonah Tate had run cattle on the flats below Ledger Gulch, and Roderick Sloane had wanted his water, then too. A different spring, the same hunger, and when Jonah said no, there'd been a fire one night in the dry season, and Jonah had been mending fence 2 miles off when he saw the smoke, and by the time he got home there was nothing left to save. His wife, his boy. The story the town told was that a lamp had tipped. Jonah had found a coal oil can in the ashes of a house that didn't burn coal oil. He'd had no proof. He'd had a can and a certainty, and no proof a court would hear. And he'd nearly killed Sloane with his hands in the street and gotten pulled off by 4 men. And then he'd done the thing that men in that country did when the law was just another room in the rich man's house. He'd gone up the mountain, and he'd stayed, and he'd let the world believe he was a ghost, because a ghost has nothing left to take. Then why come down? Maren asked him. Why for me? You didn't know me. He was quiet a long time. Inez Salazar told me, he said. Told me Conrad Dwyer went off the rim. Told me his girl was getting sold off his spring. He turned a piece of kindling over in his big scarred hands. Conrad was the only man in that valley ever stood up to Sloane and didn't fold. Stood up the same way I did and didn't run. And Sloane killed him the same as he killed mine. And I sat up here 4 years being a ghost about it. And I was done being a ghost. He looked at her. Wasn't going to let him do it twice and watch? That's all. That's the whole of it. You don't owe me a thing for it. She told him then about the rope. The good rope, coiled and dry in the tack room, that her father never went to the rim without. She told him she knew, the way you know, that her father had been killed, and that he'd died telling anyone who'd listened that the water claim under Sloane's name was a forgery, and that he'd had proof, and that she'd torn the cabin apart and never found it. Jonah set down the kindling. Where'd he keep things he didn't want found? He said. She thought about it. She thought about it for 2 days. And on the third day, she sat up in the gray before dawn with the answer whole in her mind. And it was so simple she'd been ashamed she hadn't seen it. Her father had not hidden anything in the cabin. Her father had trusted exactly one thing in the territory, and he'd said so 100 times. The water was the only honest thing. Everything else would lie to you given half a chance. They rode down to the Dwyer homestead together, in the dark of the moon, because by then Sloane had men watching it, and they went on foot the last mile through the sage, and Maren led Jonah up the slope above the spring, to the place where the granite seam came out of the ground, where the water she'd been raised on welled up cold and constant, and there, wrapped in oilcloth and tarred against the wet, wedged behind a stone in the throat of the spring, where only a man who knew the rock could reach it, were her father's papers, the original survey, the recorded claim with the dates that didn't match, a letter from a clerk in Denver who'd been paid to alter a record and couldn't live with it, naming Roderick Sloane, naming the sum, dated and signed, and under all of it, in her father's square, stubborn hand, a single page that began, "To whoever finds this when I am gone, the water was never his, and I think he means to make sure I never get to prove it." She knelt in the dark with the water running cold over her boots and read her father's handwriting, and did not cry, because crying was for grief, and what she felt was not grief. It was the other thing. It was the thing that had a use. They almost didn't make it out. Sloane's men found the horses, and there was a long bad run through the dark and the sage, and a shot that went close enough that Maren felt the wind of it, and Jonah put himself between her and the gun the whole way without ever saying a word about it, the way you'd shield a candle with your hand. They lost the riders in the timber, and went up into country no flatland horse would follow them into, and they reached the high meadow at dawn with the papers dry against Maren's chest, and that should have been the end of it. Except that men like Sloane do not lose, and a thing that cannot be taken can still be burned. He came for them himself, 8 days later, which surprised Jonah, who'd expected him to send men. He brought 6 riders and a wagon, and the kind of righteous patience that powerful men mistake for the law. He had decided evidently that the ghost and the orphan and the inconvenient papers should all become a single tragedy, a cabin fire in the high country, the sort of thing that took people who lived a long way from town. He'd done it before. He was good at it. He had no way of knowing that he was about to do it in front of the one audience that could end him, because Jonah Tate, who had spent 4 years being a ghost and learning every fold of that mountain, had not been idle in the 8 days, and the man Maren had married had sent Inez Salazar's grandson down the back trail to Denver with a copy of every page and a name. The Federal Land Office did not love many things, but it loved a forged claim and a bribed clerk who'd left a signed confession, and it especially loved them when a deputy U.S. Marshal could ride up a mountain on a clear May morning and find Roderick Sloane and 6 armed men standing in a meadow, with rifles trained on a cabin, having just, in the Marshal's plain hearing, ordered the place burned with 2 people inside. There are crimes a powerful man can talk his way out of. Being caught in the act by a federal officer, with the proof of the original crime already on file in Denver, is not generally one of them. It did not end cleanly. Nothing in that country did. There was shouting, and there was a moment where it could have gone to guns, and Sloane's easy face came apart at last, all the way down to what was under it, and what was under it was nothing. Just a small cold appetite that had eaten a town and 2 families, and would have eaten Maren too. But the Marshal had the law on his side for once, an actual man with an actual badge and 4 more like him on the trail behind, and the math had finally, after 6 years, turned. Sloane's riders were not paid enough to hang for him. One by one they let their rifles drop, and the cold appetite in the black coat understood, at the very end, that it had lost, and it had no idea how to do that, because it had never practiced. They took him down the mountain in his own wagon. He was tried in Denver, where his bank could not reach the jury, and his freight line could not lose the witnesses, and the clerk's confession did what her father's whole stubborn life had not been able to do alone. The water claim was struck from the record as a forgery. The Dwyer spring went back into Maren's name, free and clear, with the appurtenant rights restored, and a marshal's note in the file that any future trouble in Ledger Gulch over water would be a federal matter. The town, which had stood on the courthouse steps and watched her almost lose everything and done nothing, got a circuit court and a real sheriff within the year, because once the keystone is pulled out of a thing like that, the rest of it has a way of coming down. Maren and Jonah did not go back down to live. The flats held nothing for either of them but the graves of people they'd loved. They kept the spring, leased the lower pasture to a young family with more children than money, and made their life in the high meadow where the snow stayed late in the shadows, and the silence had a weight to it that in time came to feel less like loneliness and more like peace. They were married already, of course. They'd been married since the courthouse steps. But somewhere in the second year, without ever quite discussing it, they became married in the other way, the slow, true way, the way that has nothing to do with a reverend's 3 minutes, and everything to do with 10,000 ordinary mornings. She never did ask him to court her. He'd have had no idea how. He just kept being there, kept putting himself between her and the wind, until one winter night she realized she'd stopped thinking of the door he'd promised her, the open door, the one she could ride out of any time she pleased. The door was still there. She just no longer looked at it. That, she came to understand, was the whole of what love was worth in that country. Not a wall that kept you in, but a door you stopped wanting to use. The children came. A girl first, with Maren's straight back and Jonah's dark, stubborn eyes, and then a boy, and then 2 more, and the cabin grew rooms the way a tree grows, rings, a little each season until it was a real house with a real porch, where Jonah Tate, who had once been a ghost, sat in the evenings and watched his children chase each other through the long grass, and did not, anymore, look like a man who'd lost everything. He looked like a man who'd lost everything, and then, against all the odds the frontier could throw, gotten a different everything to put in its place. Years on, the way years do, the story of the wedding on the courthouse steps got told and retold in Ledger Gulch until it wore smooth and shiny and stopped being quite true. People said the mountain man had loved her at first sight. People said he'd ridden in like an avenging angel. The truth was both smaller and larger than that. He'd ridden in at a walk because he had nothing left to hurry for, and he'd married a stranger to keep a banker from doing to her what the banker had done to him, and neither one of them had felt a single soft thing in that moment, only the hard, clean click of a debt the world owed and a chance to collect it. The love had come after. The love had been built, plank by plank, the same as the house, out of nothing but the decision to keep showing up. On a night near the end of that second year, before the children, when it was still just the 2 of them and the high silence, Maren stood on the porch with her father's papers, long since filed safe in Denver, and the spring running cold below in the dark, and Jonah came out with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything, because they'd both learned the high country's lesson about how much speech a true thing actually requires. My father used to say the water was the only honest thing in the territory, Maren said at last, that everything else would lie to you given half a chance. Jonah considered that, the way he considered everything, slowly turning it over for the flaw. He was wrong about one thing then, he said. What's that? You. He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked out at the dark where the spring was. You never lied to me once, not from the steps to right now. He drank his coffee. He'd have liked that you proved him wrong, from what you tell me of him. She leaned against his shoulder. This enormous quiet man she'd married in 3 minutes in front of a town that had let her down. And she thought about the girl she'd been on the courthouse steps, thin-dressed and dry-eyed, and one signature away from losing the only honest thing her father had left her. That girl would not have believed any of this. That girl had not known yet that helplessness was not the bottom of the world, that there was something underneath even that, and that its name was not luck and was not rescue, but was, simply, the refusal of 1 or 2 stubborn people to let a thing stand that ought not to stand. The world doesn't get fixed all at once, her father had written, on a page tarred against the water. You can't fix everything, but you can fix something. You can help one person, and if enough do that, the rest follows. He died proving it, but he'd been right. The spring still ran, the claim was hers. The town had a sheriff and a court and a memory now of what it cost to look away. And up in the high meadow where the snow stayed late, a woman who'd nearly been sold off her own father's water stood on a porch she'd helped build, beside a man who'd come down off a mountain to stop it, and understood that she was, at last and entirely, free, not safe. The wilderness was never safe, not finished, the work was never finished, but free in the one way that counts, which is the freedom of a person who has chosen her own hard road with her eyes open and would not trade it for any easy one on earth. She finished her coffee. Down in the dark, the spring kept up its small, honest music, the only thing in that whole country that had never once lied, and Maren Dwyer Tate went inside out of the cold, into a house that was warm and was hers and was, against everything the world had tried, enough. What stays with me, all these years later, isn't the gold spilling across that auctioneer's table or the kiss on the courthouse steps. It's a coiled rope, dry in a tack room where it had no business being. Maren saw that rope and understood something the whole town had agreed to overlook, and that one small refusal to accept the easy story is the seed everything else grew from. Nobody handed her the truth. She had to be honest enough to admit what the rope meant, even when admitting it was more dangerous than looking away. I think about how Sloane lost, and it wasn't a gunfight that beat him. It was patience and clear thinking. Maren remembered her father saying the water was the only honest thing in the territory, and instead of treating that as sorrow, she treated it as a clue. She reasoned her way to the throat of the spring, behind a stone only a man raised on that rock would know to reach. That's the part I'd want any young person to sit with. The answer was there the whole time. What it took was the steadiness to think instead of panic, to ask where a careful man hides what a powerful man wants buried. And then there's the cost. Conrad died proving the water was never Sloane's, and he never got to see it set right. Jonah spent 4 years a ghost on a mountain because he had a coal oil can and a certainty and no proof a court would hear. Neither of those things was wasted, but neither was enough alone. It took Maren to carry it the last mile, and it took her refusing to quit on a night when a bullet came close enough to feel. Courage in that country was never one grand moment. It was the decision to get up the next morning and do the hard thing again, and then again until the math finally turned. I've come to believe that a person is built out of exactly those three things working together. Doing right when looking away would be simpler. Thinking clearly when fear is screaming for something faster. And the plain stubbornness to keep showing up long after the easy hope is gone. Maren had all three, not because she was born with them, but because losing her father stripped away every reason she had to be anything less. She told me once that the door Jonah promised her, the open one she could ride out of any time, stayed open her whole life. She just stopped wanting to use it. That's the truth I keep. Freedom was never the gold or the rescue or even the marriage. It was becoming the kind of woman who could stand on her own porch, having chosen her own hard road with her eyes open, and want nothing else. You don't inherit that. You build it, plank by plank, out of every honest, clear-headed, stubborn choice you were brave enough to make.